Advanced Residential Applications and Case Studies. Chapter 5, the reporting process. Page 5, Standards Rule 2-2, continued. Number 5, state the real property interest appraised. Be careful to remember, if using boilerplate appraisal reporting templates when reporting those occasional appraisal assignments that are not valuing fee simple property rights, you should clearly state the relevant property rights appraised. Even though SR 2-2 only requires that you state the property rights, a minimum level of detail, remember that this is a minimum requirement. You should consider a greater level of detail. If you believe a greater level of detail and explanation of the property rights will be beneficial or necessary for the understanding of the client and intended users. For example, if you are valuing a property that is subject to a life estate, you may need to provide additional explanatory comments in the report in order to foster intended users' understanding. Refer to Advisory Opinion 38 for examples of reporting detail, stating, and summarizing. Number 6, state the type and definition of value and cite the source of the definition. Comment. Stating the definition of value also requires any comments needed to clearly indicate to the intended users how the definition is being applied. When reporting an opinion of value, state whether the opinion of value is in terms of cash or of financing terms equivalent to cash, or based on non-market financing or financing with unusual conditions or incentives. When an opinion of value is based on non-market financing terms or financing with unusual conditions or incentives, summarize the terms of such financing and explain any influence on value. When an opinion of reasonable exposure time has been developed in compliance with Standards Rule 1-2C, the opinion must be stated in the report. Commonly used residential appraisal reporting forms typically have the definition of value set forth within the pre-printed part of the form. This pre-printed wording would serve to both define the value and cite its source. As noted in the earlier comments regarding reporting property rights other than fee simple, here too you must be especially careful to clearly and prominently state the type of value so that the client and intended users will not overlook or fail to notice when the type of value is something other than market value. Clients who regularly deal with appraisals are just like appraisers in the sense that they tend to be in market value mode. When you're using a different type of value, such as liquidation value or value in use, make sure you get the client's attention in the report so they do not miss this important fact. Again, you may need to do more than merely state the type and definition of value. Some degree of elaboration may be needed. Don't forget to cite the source of the definition as well. Roman numeral 7. State the effective date of the appraisal and the date of the report. Consider whether you should further elaborate on the significance of differing market conditions that exist as of the report date, as opposed to the actual market conditions, or assumed conditions in the case of a prospective value opinion existing as of the effective date. End of page. Page 6, Standards Rule 2-2 continued. Number 8, summarize the scope of work used to develop the appraisal. Comment: summarizing the scope of work includes disclosure of research and analysis performed and might also include disclosure of research and analysis not performed. In an appraisal report, you must summarize your scope of work. Once again, when reporting the appraisal of a complex property, more information and detail is generally better than merely providing the minimum required when it comes to telling the appraisal story. It is not specifically required that the appraisal report have a separate identified section titled Scope of Work, but many appraisers prefer to do this. As you should recall, one of the most commonly applied solutions to a competency problem when the appraiser is lacking in knowledge or experience is to work in association with a more experienced appraiser. Whether that other appraiser assists in the entire assignment or just in certain approaches to value or analysis, you are required to summarize those steps in the appraisal process that the other appraiser completed in your report. This is true regardless of whether the appraiser signs the report and certification. If you have designated scope of work section in your appraisal report, that is the logical place to summarize the assistance you received. Your client should easily be able to determine which steps you completed and which steps were completed by one or more other individuals. Standards Rule 2-3, which establishes the minimum content for the certification statement, also requires you to state in the certification the names of other individuals who provided significant appraisal assistance. You are not required to restate in the certification exactly what those individuals did. Number 9, summarize the extent of any significant real property appraisal assistance. Often the appraisal of a complex property necessitates an unusual or creative application of the valuation approaches, or it does not allow the appraiser to utilize a valuation method or appraisal technique that would typically be completed. It is very important to explain why you completed the assignment the way you did. Along with why you did not utilize methods or techniques that your client would probably expect you to complete. End of page. Page 7, Standards Rule 2-2 continued. Number 10, provide sufficient information to indicate that the appraiser complied with the requirements of Standard 1 by summarizing the appraisal methods and techniques employed, stating the reasons for excluding the sales comparison, cost or income approaches, if any have not been developed, summarizing the results of analyzing the subject sales, agreements of sale, options, and listings in accordance with Standards Rule 1-5. Comment: if such information is unobtainable, statement on the efforts undertaken by the appraiser to obtain the information is required. If such information is irrelevant, a statement acknowledging the existence of the information, citing its lack of relevance, is required. Stating the value, opinions, and conclusions, and summarizing the information analyzed and the reasoning that supports the analysis, opinions, and conclusions, including reconciliation of the data and approaches. State the use of the real estate existing as of the effective date and the use of the real estate reflected in the appraisal. When an opinion of highest and best use was developed by the appraiser, state that opinion and summarize the support and rationale for that opinion. We have already discussed in the Standard 1 section of the vital nature of the research and analysis required in Standards Rule 1-5, prior sales, listing history, purchase agreements, etc. Here in the reporting section, we are required to summarize those analyses. We are also reminded to give a clear explanation in those, hopefully, rare instances where it was not possible to access and analyze this information. Remember our earlier discussion of cut and dried highest and best use decisions in many typical residential real estate appraisals. We said a complex property may require significant reasoning and analysis to determine highest and best use. Well, here is where you are required to summarize, that's highlighted, that highest and best use rationale. One of the glaring deficiencies in many form appraisal reports of typical properties is the appraiser's failure to summarize the highest and best use rationale and conclusions. Many appraisers are guilty of merely checking a box, stating the highest and best use in appraisal reports. Do not, that's highlighted, make that mistake. It is a terrible error in the appraisal report, and it is an even worse mistake in the appraisal report of a complex property. Clearly and conspicuously state all extraordinary assumptions and hypothetical conditions, and state that their use might have affected the assignment results. Include assigned certification in accordance with Standards Rule 2-3. The report certification is the place where the appraiser is required to disclose prior services that the appraiser provided on the subject property within the prior 3 years. An appraiser is required to disclose to the client before, that's highlighted, the agreement to perform the assignment any prior services provided by the appraiser on the subject property within the prior 3 years. This means any property-related services, whether it be an appraisal review, real estate brokerage, property management, etc., must be disclosed. This initial disclosure can be oral, by email, text message, or in writing. If after the initial disclosure of prior services, the appraiser is engaged to complete the appraisal, the appraiser must insert in the report certification a written disclosure of the prior services provided. The mere occurrence, that's highlighted, of a prior assignment is what is being disclosed. No disclosure of confidential information or assignment results can be made. All of that is highlighted. An example of this written disclosure would be, I have completed an appraisal on this subject property within the last 3 years. End of page.